I think we will get started. Um, I want to begin with, my name is Brenna Bandar, and I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of where I and others affiliated to UBC are speaking from. So we are speaking from the unceded and traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And I would like to encourage everyone who is Zooming in to think about whose land they are situated on. And I'd also like us to bear in mind or to think about what it means to acknowledge that we are on unceded land and how that calls into question things like the legitimacy of a colonial system of law and property. It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here to our third seminar, which is a part of an anti-racism in the law initiative that we began at Allard Law Faculty earlier this year, or this academic year. And ARLI is a rather ad hoc group of faculty who came together with a shared intention to examine the relationship between race, racism, and the law, and to consider what anti-racism and decolonization might look like in the present and in our future. My colleague, Sara Ghebremusse, will be chairing and moderating today's seminar, and I would like to introduce Sara and then pass the proceedings off to her. Dr. Sara Ghebremusse is assistant professor in the law faculty, and she writes, researches, and teaches in the areas of African law and society, law and development, mining governance in the global south, human rights, and transnational law. She's published in these fields, and she's also presented her research and her work at numerous different places throughout the world. Sara, I can say, is very committed to anti-racism work in the faculty. She's a member also of the UBC Black Caucus, and it's wonderful to have Sara as a colleague. And so with that, I'm going to sign off and pass things over to Sara. Thanks.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, Brenna. Good afternoon, everyone. I am delighted to welcome Robyn Maynard and Leanne Betasamosake Simpson to the Allard School of Law today, and to moderate our conversation about various themes discussed in their forthcoming book, Rehearsals for Living. Their works serve, amongst other things, to vehemently oppose the notion of Canadian exceptionalism, and I have no doubt that Rehearsals for Living continues in this vein of opposition. Robyn Maynard is a Black feminist scholar activist and author of the national bestseller, Policing Black Lives: State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. Robyn is the winner of the 2018 Author of the Year Award by Montreal's Black History Month, and was nominated for Writers' Trust Dane Ogilvy Prize for LGBTQ emerging writers. Her writing on borders, policing, abolition, and Black feminism is taught widely in universities across Canada and the United States. Her expertise is regularly sought in local, national, and international media outlets, and she has spoken before parliamentary subcommittees, the Human Rights Committee of the Senate, and the United Nations Working Group of Experts on People of African Descent. Robyn is currently a PhD candidate and Vanier Scholar at the University of Toronto, where she is the recipient of the Shirk Talent Award. Leanne Betasamosake Simpson is a renowned Michi-Sege Nishnabek scholar, writer, and artist who has been widely recognized as one of the most compelling Indigenous voices of her generation. Her work breaks open the intersections between politics, story, and song, bringing audiences into a rich and layered world of sound, light, and sovereign creativity. Working for 2 decades as an independent scholar using Anishinaabe intellectual practices, Leanne has lectured and taught extensively at universities across Canada and the United States, and has 20 years experience with Indigenous land-based education. She holds a PhD from the University of Manitoba and teaches at the Jicenta Center for Research and Learning in Denade. Leanne is the author of 7 previous books, including Noopiming, The Cure for White Ladies, The Accident of Being Lost, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back, and As We Have Always Done. Leanne is also a musician. Her latest release, Theory of Ice, was named to the Polaris Prize shortlist, and she is the 2021 winner of the Prism Prize's Willie Dunn Award. Before we begin our discussion, Robyn and Leanne will treat us to 2 readings from Rehearsals for Living. The book, which was written during the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic, is a series of letters they wrote to each other. Sparked by friendship and solidarity, and by a desire for kinship and connection in a world shattering under the intersecting crises of pandemic, police killings, and climate catastrophe, their letters soon grew into a powerful exchange on the subject of where we go from here. An early review of Rehearsals of Living by Andrea Ritchie, Rehearsals for Living by Andrea Ritchie describes the book as lyrical, visionary, and transcendent, and that it creates a literary maroon space deeply rooted in unique and overlapping histories and presence in which to dream abolition, home, love, land, and libertary forms of governance, and life itself. Rehearsals for Living is undoubtedly a must-read book for those interested in building a new world. Please join me in welcoming Robyn and Leanne. So, Robyn, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sara, for that introduction. And I also want to thank Brenna Bendar for inviting us and for hosting us here today. I'll be reading a short piece from the introduction, the introductory letter of Rehearsals for Living. Just one moment here. Dear Leanne, 5 years ago now, I sat down with a copy of your book, As We Have Always Done. I'd planned to flip through the first few pages of my morning coffee. In the end, though, I stayed put, reading almost the whole text in one go, and was suddenly overcome with a strong feeling that I wanted to know you. Your words beckoned me to join you in what you called constellations of co-resistance, constellations that affirmed life and world-making in a time of acute racial violence. We spoke on the phone shortly after. I remember that I was in a Subway restaurant in downtown Montreal, squatting the free Wi-Fi to do a final fact check of some op-ed I'd written. I could barely make out your voice over the very loud and very bad music. I don't recall the details of what we talked about, but I know that I've wanted to chart old and new constellations with you ever since. I've been meaning to write you for a long time, and it's hard to know where to begin. So I guess I'll start where I'm at. I can't stop doom scrolling the multiple crises of our time. At this moment, I'm preoccupied and filled with dread by the reports of rising temperatures, the just about last chances being regularly leveled by climate scientists, the continually shelved fact of the matter that things must be drastically and immediately shifted if we are to avoid untold suffering. I'm preoccupied with what goes unwritten in so many reports, but that I know in my bones. Some communities' untold suffering will vastly exceed that experienced by others. Some communities have been facing untold suffering for multiple generations. I don't want to live in this preoccupation, in this dread that sometimes comes to visit me and threatens to immobilize. So I suppose this is me reaching out for a leveling of the ground beneath my feet, for communion, to help transform the source of this dread into a place from which we can instead plot, conspire, dream, and attend to life otherwise. Talking and thinking with you has helped me focus on the vitality, the livingness of the traditions that our work emerges from, regardless of what the last several centuries of European atrocities have wreaked on our peoples. I don't see you as much as I would like, and the phone is not my medium. So I've decided to write you this letter. I'm writing you a letter, even though it feels cringy because I'm shy. I'm writing you a letter, even though I may never send it, even though you may never write me back. I'm writing you a letter at the end of this world. From Cyclone Ida in Malawi, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, to Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, the devastating forest fires displacing indigenous communities from the Amazon rainforest through to the Mishki-Gogam and Ojibwe Nation in Northwest Ontario, our respective communities, that is, Black and Indigenous communities, are collectively positioned on the very forefront of the unfolding catastrophe. Even if we didn't take into account the dramatic shifts that are occurring and will further occur with the melting of the Arctic ice caps, rising seawaters, eroded shorelines, desertification, and species extinction that are now nearly, if not totally inevitable, the reality is not only are an array of world endings already before us, they have already arrived. The apocalypse is imagined, after all, in most classic Euro-Western settler tropes, in terms of lack of clean drinking water, the destruction of places that they live, the poisoning of the earth, inhumane and restrictive responses to people left hungry, displaced, in desperation. This is a condition that is already deeply familiar to our kin across Turtle Island and globally. To remix Public Enemy, Armageddon been in effect. It is the apocalypses of slavery and settler colonialism that bind our collective past and presence together in the calamity at hand. Today, the racially uneven environmental catastrophes of the present are inextricably connected to the unfinished catastrophes of 1492, the two genocides at the heart of the Americas, to paraphrase M. Norbisi Phillip, when a death-making commitment to extraction and dispossession took hold on a global scale. This created a logic and political economy in which our ancestors became, through distinct but interrelated processes, what Cedric J. Robinson once described as a collection of things of convenience for use and or eradication. As we are confronted with the crisis of the Earth's viability then, amidst so many crises, I'm writing you to think together about what it means for us to work toward building livable lives together in the wreckage. As I write you from the end of this world, I'm also very aware of both of our respective, if unidentical, subject positions as domestic enemies inside the settler state, and of our presence within one of the main arteries of Western Empire. I'm writing you from the belly of the beast. Despite its ongoing pretensions of being a benevolent nation state, Canada plays an important role in the massive carbon unloading and the ecological and human devastation wrought by extractive industries. These industries produce over 50% of the world's carbon emissions, not to mention the cataclysmic environmental devastation of the tar sands pipelines that run through more than 350 Indigenous nations in so-called Canada alone. Much of the unmaking of Black and Indigenous lives and the ecosystems that have historically sustained our lives, spanning Turtle Island, the Caribbean, Africa, and South and Central America, can be traced right back to here. In fact, while I'm haunted by the specter of the pending crises, there's something about our sheer physical proximity to the authors of these monstrosities that is weighing heavily on me these days. Out of a mix of curiosity and compulsion, I created a Google Maps itinerary to figure out how long it would take me to travel from my house to some of the places where our collective apocalypses are being mapped out. A kind of walking tour that maps out some of the contemporary architects of the warfare against human and non-human life. As it turns out, it would take 1 hour and 12 minutes to walk from my home to the main office of James Bay Resources Limited, a Canadian company that is based in the Niger Delta region that is the homelands of the Ogoni peoples. In the Delta and across the region, gas flares resulting from oil extraction have been burning off CO2 emissions that are comparable to the annual output of Sweden. It is a site of both racial and ecological destruction. Mutated food crops, toxic drinking water, rainwater that melts through the tin roofs of people's homes, and a wide assortment of permanent human and non-human health crises. Of course, even as this site of transnational anti-Black violence produces flares that are visible from space, there's no discernible trace of this available at company headquarters. That would be uncivilized. Enabling Google Street View, it is clear that little evidence links the decisions made in this metropolitan office to the crimes enacted over there. A medium-rise gray building flanked by 2 Starbucks cafes and underground parking. 9 minutes after leaving this office front, where I would see nothing and feel everything, I would arrive at the headquarters of Bellow Sun Mining Corporation. Here my street view seems to glitch, only showing me the front of a seemingly closed dollar store called Rainbow Jade, inside of what appears to be a mini mall. But honestly, this does not matter. I just know that I am likely not missing much, even as this company is set to build Brazil's largest open-face gold mine, the Volta Grande mine, in the heart of the still burning Amazon rainforest. You can see these fires too, from NASA's cameras in space. This mine, this future abomination that is orchestrated from somewhere else, probably close to Rainbow Jade, will leach toxins into the lands and waters of the Indigenous Daruna and Orea peoples. But bad news for Indigenous peoples is good news for colonizers everywhere. A CBC News tweet following the election of white supremacist President Jair Bolsonaro declared, critics have lambasted the former paratrooper for his homophobic, racist, and misogynist statements, but his government could open new investment opportunities for Canadian investors. Colonizer meet colonizer. It does not take great imagination to say that if I can't virtually see this building, it is probably either gray or brownish or whitish, probably tall, and it wouldn't take much time to take it in. And only 1 minute after leaving this building, whatever it really looks like, even as I've crossed a hemisphere in terms of impact, I will find myself at the last stop, the headquarters of Copper One, yet another high-rise. Currently undertaking a legal battle against the Algonquins of Barrier Lake to mine the resources on their traditional hunting grounds, Copper One is not yet dissuaded, despite years of community resistance in the form of blockades and legal challenges. Anyways, you might note that this tour starts and ends somewhat arbitrarily. It could go on all day, with more than 50% of the world's mining companies traded through the Toronto Stock Exchange. This tour of invisible carnage shows that Toronto really is the global hub that it's so widely celebrated to be. It is on and around Bay Street that we find the direct lines between capitalist accumulation and those racial subjects whose lands and labors are being accumulated and poisoned. It also shows us that the climate crisis is not coming. For some, its arrival began long ago. All of this in 90 minutes, likely less because I am a fast walker. I'm drawn to this walk that links Toronto and the settler nation state to the global flows of capital that emerge from an accumulation of racial and ecological assaults, largely but not exclusively on Black and Indigenous lives, both here and a multitude of elsewheres. Maybe we will walk this route together sometime. I think I would like to. But I'm not sure why I keep refreshing the browser, expecting for something more to reveal itself to me, as I look for some trace or hint of the barbarism behind the veneer. Toronto, like the Canadian society it encapsulates, has explicitly evolved to keep the violence on which it relies firmly out of view, a perfectly modern society that tidily keeps its atrocities out of plain sight. I know that I will make this pilgrimage on my own at some point, possibly before I send you this letter. I also know that I will be disappointed and then irritated with myself for being disappointed and then devastated at the world that white supremacy built. I'm acutely aware that it is our collective destruction as Black people, as Indigenous peoples, along with the rest of the global wretched of the earth, that is being drawn up in these boardrooms of global finance, and theirs and their grandchildren too, though they are too arrogant to see this. The IPCC report brings to light what is to come. Unknown levels of fire, floods, droughts, famine, and shortages of all kinds. Faced with a planetary crisis on multiple frequencies, the state and corporate ruling classes work together to commit and recommit the planet anew to death or near death. And yet, even as the final assault on the viability of the earth is being authored on the many Bay Streets of the global north, this is being called the Anthropocene, a crisis called by human activity that puts human life at risk. This is an affront, because it's not humans, is it? Human has never been a politically neutral category. In this anthropocentric framing of the climate crisis, it is important to ask who exactly is imagined as a human. It is not humanity that poisons so much of earthly human and non-human life, but a small and highly powerful minority of humanity and the order that they have imposed on all earthly life. The climate catastrophe was not born of mankind, but from the slave plantation, the settler town, the prison, the reservation. For this reason, it's unsurprising that the solution being forwarded by those in power are more of the same. The border wall, the immigration detention center, the refugee camp, the open pit mine. For us to live in anything that I hope we could one day call freedom, it is necessary to put a swift end to the death drive disguised as worldview, the murderous episteme that is being imposed on us by the master, settler, CEO. All world endings are not tragic. There are some world endings that I'm comfortable with. In order to make earthly planetary survival possible, some versions of this world need to end. Some worlds, after all, depended on the ongoing violent, always racial and gender differentiated foreclosures of other worlds. To avoid the worst case scenarios now predicted by global scientific consensus, it is necessary for us to have the courage to envision the end of this world, that is, the world that white supremacy built, to move toward liberatory futures that are premised on life rather than human, ecological, animal, and microbial waste. This disruption is what Fanon was getting at when he wrote in The Wretched of the Earth that decolonization, which sets out to change the order of the world, is obviously a program of complete disorder. Disorder is not the same as chaos. It implies instead a radical rupture from the dominant order, which is, after all, murderous. A program of disorder implies here that we radically alter and indeed breach entirely with the current order of things and the global violences upon which this order relies. I believe that world ending and world making can occur simultaneously. Given that racial and ecological violence are interwoven and inextricable from one another, more now than ever, Black and Indigenous communities who are globally positioned as first to die within the climate crisis are also on the front lines of the world-making practices that threaten to overthrow the current death-making global episteme. Perhaps our communities, quite literally the post-apocalyptic survivors of world endings already, are best positioned to imagine what this might be. This, after all, is the radical promise, as of yet unachieved, that was and is extended to us by the world-making projects of abolition and decolonization. If our histories are intimately intertwined with one another's, so too are our futures. Maybe writing together, walking together, witnessing these times together in this way will help us to forge ahead differently. And maybe it will help us to anchor ourselves and one another as we try to find a way to map out liberated futures for our children and theirs in a time when any notion of future feels unnavigable. I'm hoping mostly in writing you that maybe this grounding together will help remind us that anyways, we and ours have been building livable worlds to live in all along, despite and against forces aligned to steal our light, and that we will continue to do so no matter what comes our way. Thank you.
Miigwech, Robyn, it was wonderful to hear your voice and to see you read those words. Thank you. Ani Kinawaya, everyone, I'm so honored to be here today as part of the Anti-Racism in Law initiative. And I'm so grateful to Sara and Brenna for their labor in organizing these events. I think anti-racism initiatives, particularly in the academy and in departments of law, are just so important to me. Robyn and I are reading from our book that's coming out really soon, Rehearsals for Living. It's being published by Knopf Canada on June 15th in Canada, and in the US by Haymarket Books. So we are past the deadline where we can change any of the typos or any of the mistakes, and we're just waiting for things to come back from the printer. I wanted to mention that the cover art that some of you saw in the poster, I think, is by Haradina Pindell, who's a filmmaker, archivist, curator, activist, amazing artist. The intro of the book is by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and the afterword is by Robyn D.G. Kelly. And so the book starts with Robyn, and that first letter, it's a little longer than she was able to share today. And then the next part is my first letter, and I'm going to read a little bit from that today, and then we can come together and visit and talk. Robyn, the first thing I underlined in my now worn out copy of your book, Policing Black Lives, was the very first line of the acknowledgement section. Writing Policing Black Lives was a community affair born out of movement work. It is geared towards nourishing those same movements that have given me life over the last years. That was a quote from Robyn. I knew after reading that first line that this book was going to be distinct. Policing Black Lives was written for different reasons than most books published in Canada, reasons that I had profound respect for. Knowledge, research, analysis, and writing born out of movement work and geared towards nourishing, sustaining, and propelling movements for Black life. Robust intellectual work in service of radical Black futurities. Policing Black Lives holds up community and shines a light on generations of freedom fighters whose individual and collective sacrifices have brought us to this moment. As I read on, I underlined your careful and gentle insistence that Black and Indigenous struggles, while distinct, were also linked. This was significant to me because it gestures toward a more rigorous and nuanced relationality between Black and Indigenous communities, reminiscent of radical Black feminist traditions embodied in so many writers like Makeda Silvera, Norbesi Philip, Dion Brand, and Afea Cooper. In Policing Black Lives, you were the first one to gather together the work of Black feminists and organizers and provide us with a volcano of meticulously researched evidence that destroyed Canadian innocence and exceptionalism with regards to transatlantic slavery and anti-Blackness. In Policing Black Lives, you taught me abolition on stolen land is the practice of caring. It's one of my favorite Robyn Maynard lines. My book, As We Have Always Done, came out in the same year as your Policing Black Lives. I remember wishing your book had come out first because it would have made As We Have Always Done more complete and rigorous. I would have brought Policing Black Lives into conversation with the chapters in As We Have Always Done, and from an Indigenous perspective, point towards the same robust and nuanced relationality between Indigenous and Black communities you had done in Policing Black Lives, albeit from my own Anishinaabe perspective. When an occasion presented itself to launch As We Have Always Done in Jojega or Montreal in Kanegihaga territory where you were living at the time, I wanted to invite you into a conversation, a thinking through between ourselves and our books. You graciously accepted the invitation, and our conversation took place on April 14th, 2018. This was the very first time we had met in person. I remember the Black community of Montreal showing up in power at the event. I remember being very nervous, as one should be when their first encounter with someone is on a stage with a mic in front of a beautiful, articulate, intelligent audience. I remember your pink lipstick. I remember my Blistex. I remember being painfully aware that I was dressed like I was from Ontario. I can't remember very much about what we talked about, but we obviously had the sense to record it because there is an edited transcript of part of our conversation in Until We Are Free, Reflections on Black Lives Matters in Canada. This was our first visit. Roughly a year later in 2019, as part of my work at the Dechinta Center for Research and Learning in Benende, or the Northwest Territories, I helped conceptualize, organize, and actualize a solidarity gathering that took place in March in the territory of the Yellowknives Dene First Nation. Our idea was simple: to invite a small group of Black, Brown, and Indigenous activists, thinkers, writers, and organizers to spend time with us in the spring on an island in what the Yellowknives Dene know as Tinde, or Big Lake. Together, we fished nets under the ice, traveled by snowmobile and sleigh across the frozen lake, shared moose ribs cooked over the fire, stories from the Yellowknives Dene elders, our own ideas, and time with each other. We wanted to invest in our relationship with each other and our affinities outside of the institution, the internet, and crises, because we believed that the land would pull out a different set of conversations and gift us with a different way of relating. We wanted to sit together on the land, immersed in a Dene world, engaged in a practice of Dene hospitality, to see if we related to each other in a different way. This is exactly what happened. The land nurtured a set of conversations in a way of relating to each other outside of the institution and its formations. I remember you and I eating muskox around the fire, talking about how different eating muskox around a fire in the bush was from meeting in a hallway or a bar at a conference or interacting online. We were also meeting, and there was no crisis or blockade or protest or agenda. We were coming together to nourish each other, to relate to each other, to listen, to share, and to breathe together, to use Norbesi Philip's thinking. I could intellectualize about the experience and speak in terms of relationality and relationship building, something I think Black and Indigenous activists in the 1960s and 1970s understood far better than us. I could talk about this from an Indigenous methodological angle, with visiting and developing relationships of trust as foundational to any exchange of knowledge and experience. I could write about the spiritual dimension of this work from, again, an Indigenous perspective, being surrounded by trees, medicine, air, sky, and water. In a sense, though, none of that particularly matters, other than to say, I think land-based politics grounded in a sustained and nurturing relationship with the natural world and in protecting nature as a means of protecting ourselves can be one generative means of nourishing Black and Indigenous politics of solidarity. Our starting point was simple, that land and placemaking, although perhaps different, were and remain important to both Black and Indigenous peoples. Our starting point was a refusal of the nation state and the racial capitalism, white supremacy, and heteropatriarchy embodied in those structures. Our starting point was a recognition that transatlantic slavery, and as Zaidea Hartman says, its afterlives, and colonialism mean we have distinctive and intertwined histories, presence, and distinctive and intertwined theory and world-building practices. We imagined the synergistic potential of Black land politics and Indigenous land politics towards liberated lands and bodies. After that gathering, the possibilities to continue this work seemed endless. Trips to the Sugar Bush, hikes in downtown Toronto, exchanges between our freedom schools, gatherings in the Caribbean, and then the pandemic hit. Our lives shrunk into our home spaces during stay-at-home orders. There was an urgency in addressing the pandemic under white supremacy because we knew that Black, Brown, and Indigenous peoples are always the first to die, and that any state solutions will be made to first save white people's lives and livelihoods. Zoom seemed like the very last place we wanted to continue this work. In fact, to me, it felt like virtual environments were antithetical to this work. And so you and I decided to write each other letters because we couldn't see each other in person. As an honored radical Black feminist methodology of scaffolding the intimate and personal within the global, letter writing made sense. We decided to not only write what we know, but to attempt to think through things together, to generate through this intentional relationship a sort of study of Black and Indigenous relationality through the study of our own responsive relationality. In hindsight, and after reading Catherine McKittrick's Dear Science, each of us drew on our distinct rebellious methodologies in this project. For you, Black theory, story, knowledge, and methodologies of knowledge production. For me, Anishinaabe story as theory, knowledge, and methodologies of knowledge production. The intersection was friendship, collaboration, song, story, movement work, citations, analytics, and oral practices. These interstitial spaces are this project. We made a commitment to each other to think alongside each other through the chaos of the global COVID-19 pandemic, through the ongoing pandemic of Black and Indigenous death and erasure, and through the beautiful revolutions of Black and Indigenous organizing and resistance. We agreed to be first and foremost empathetic, responsible, and gentle with each other, which required a trust and a vulnerability that for me was new in intellectual work. We did not shy away from the issues and tensions between our two communities. What began as a series of letters with footnotes between us has grown into something that has expanded outside of the two of us and then growing into Rehearsals for Living. And it grew primarily because Dion Brandt found out what we were doing and encouraged us to grow it. This book is a chronicle of our thinking in a particular moment of time, that beginning stage of the pandemic, when we didn't know it was the beginning. It's messy, it's incomplete, it's also gentle. It is in its simplest form a record of our relationality. The recording of this record required a divestment of the arrogance of the expert in favor of openness, intimacy, care, and humility. And so these are also songs that chronicle our love and friendship. And like making a record, listening became perhaps the most important methodology. Robyn, you are a fully formed thinker, writer, and researcher, not because of the credentials of the Academy, but because of your practice, your ethics, and your bodies of work. You are steeped in an extensive network of movement and organizing experience in Black systems of knowledge production, analysis, and theory making, in addition to the written work of Black and anti-colonial scholars. Robyn Maynard, I have learned so very much from you and those formations of young Black activists on our street, bringing forth new worlds before our very eyes. There are many Indigenous and Black peoples that have done and are doing the same kinds of thinking in the Academy, outside on the streets, and in encampments, prisons, around kitchen tables, and in the bush. We are centering Anishinaabe and Black, not because we don't value our relationships and solidarities with anti-colonial racialized peoples in Canada, but because we are Indigenous and Black. Wewene, we will go carefully. Miigwech.
No, well, I mean, thank you both for sharing those very powerful excerpts from Rehearsals for Living. I can't wait to read the other letters and to engage in the conversation that the two of you had early on in the pandemic. So I'll kick off our discussion with a few questions of my own before turning to any questions that are posed by the audience. So if anyone in the audience, if you have a question, please don't hesitate to write it in the Q&A box, and I will track those and get to those questions momentarily. So I want to start our conversation first by talking about the COVID-19 pandemic, since this is where you began your writing project. And since so much of the pandemic has been marked by protests at various moments over the last 2 years. So the two of you began writing your letters shortly after the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and Breonna Taylor, which had sparked massive protest movements in the summer of 2020. Now your book is being released soon after mostly white male antagonists invaded Ottawa to protest COVID mandates and vaccines while espousing white nationalist and racist ideals. What are your thoughts on the racial trajectory of the pandemic over the last 2 years, and how we are potentially emerging from the pandemic with less resolve to repair the disproportionate effects on racialized communities, both in Canada and globally, in favor of lessening restrictions on freedoms as framed by predominantly white privileged people? Either one of you can go first.
Sure. I'm happy to start, and then maybe I can toss it over to you, Leanne. But yeah, I mean, so we started this writing before the police killings, before, again, that very revolutionary summer that took place. So in fact, something that was really beautiful about living through that time together was witnessing, of course, the beginning of this pandemic, and really that first wave of organizing that was happening, especially with people behind bars, with the hunger strikes, for example, by the Black migrants who undertook the hunger strike in the Laval prison, and of course across institutions, of already seeing this mass resistance of people who were being the first really exposed in these congregate settings and the last to be impacted. So I think I always just really like to highlight that as sort of the if we look at the sort of beginning of pandemic resistance as really beginning behind bars. And I think that's something that is so crucial. But if we think about what was happening right before that as well, of course, there was this massive movement in solidarity with Wet'suwet'en. So we've really seen this this ongoing transformation of sort of passing batons from these movements of Black and Indigenous radicalism back and forth through one another. And I think you're pointing out something as well that is really, the difficulty of seeing everything that was opened and made possible, not by quite the idea of pandemic as portals, but what happened with this idea that suddenly we had massive amounts of the population of young people starting to question the very idea of what safety is and what security is, and really divorcing that from police and policing in this huge awakening. Because of course we have generations of Black feminist and racialized scholars who have been trying to create the idea of what a new world can be, right? Of trying to say that abolition can be the future, that we can abolish carceral systems and create new ways of living. But this is something as an invitation, as an opening that I think had never been quite so, spread across society, becoming this dominant idea with the words abolition appearing in things like Maclean's magazine, right? So we saw this transformation and a sense of possibility that I think is so vital. And I do think that when I try to think about really the horrific movements that have happened since then, particularly with the so-called freedom convoys, I think it's really important to remember this as part of a backlash against what was something that was actually so incredibly transformative, something that was so incredibly powerful that it really did shake the foundations of the society that we live in today. And really this retrenchments to try to redefine what it means to fight for freedom in a narrow way, to redefine safety as something that's increasingly narrow. And again, bringing back the idea of public and freedom to these ideas that only relate to the idea of white men, right? So I think if we really see it as a pushback against what it meant to imagine an expansive world with protection for all, and questioning very notions of policing and prisons, and thinking about what it could actually mean to really see transformative shifts, what we're actually seeing is a pushback, right? A pushback that's not the right to be safe, but really the right to harm. So I think that, understanding that within the context of what was actually opened up and what was made possible, and the threat that posed to white supremacy as a governing feature, right? Remembering that what we saw in terms of the white lash was not only populist, but was funded by, by conservatives, right? That what we're actually seeing is a very well-funded movement to undo the really crucial transformations that we have lived through and crucially are still living through, right? So I think that everything that was learned, those possibilities that were learned, that young people, especially in Black and working class and multiracial communities, saw in terms of the power of really demanding abolition, decolonization, that knowledge was not undone by these things, by for example, the Freedom Convoy, right? That's an attempt to scare us back, but that actually knowledge can't be undone. The notion that perhaps you could live in a society in which Black and Indigenous communities aren't being conscripted to death, violent death at the hands of police, the slow structural violence, that we could actually live without that and imagine something better. I think it's really important to remember that those freedom dreams, to use Robin Kelly's words, are still there, even if the headlines, of course, have turned away. But the seeds that were planted are still growing. And if we look to really what's happening all across the country and the new kinds of solidarities that we're going to need to get through this time of, even pulling back public health measures even more, of rising white nationalism and war, I think are just really going to test us. But at the same time, these infrastructures were already in place, and I think were massively expanded and are not gone from that moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Leanne?
Well, I think if I go back, I was thinking a lot about the Wet'suwet'en resistance. I was thinking a lot about blockades. I was writing something in the period right before the pandemic on a short history of the blockades. And now that word in this moment has a completely different meaning than when I was writing that book. And so I think those beginning stages of the pandemic, I think Robyn and I were writing back and forth. There was a lot of organizing. There was a lot of mutual aid projects. There was a lot of hope as an emotion, maybe not as a practice, but hope as an emotion, that maybe this would be the opportunity where we would come together and we would do something different. It's a very difficult thing, I think, for me to write during write the moment or write the movement when it's happening, because I think as an academic, you want to kind of take a step back and you want time sort of distills things down, and meaning kind of gets collectively generated. And so I think that was one of the things that Robyn and I we had to be pretty vulnerable in the writing. And I felt like we were guessing, and at sometimes I thought, oh my goodness, I think we're being too pessimistic and we're being too like negative. And then now 2 years later, we didn't see the truck. We didn't see that big backlash coming in the form of this white supremacist protest under the guise of protesting vaccine mandates, plowing through our communities into this occupation of Ottawa. I think that it wasn't too negative. It wasn't too skeptical. If anything, it wasn't critical enough to see what could happen, and sort of remembering those early days of the pandemic and all of that organizing and that feeling of hope, to now thinking of what's happened in Afghanistan, thinking of what's happened in Palestine, and now Ukraine. It seems like everything has gotten a little bit worse, and all of our sort of predictions about who was going to be impacted by this pandemic and who would sail through were bang on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just thinking about the last 2 years, there was that sense of hope, I think, for many of us from marginalized and disempowered communities, that maybe this was the wake-up call, that the violence, the everyday violence that we experience is just more visible now, that when you see the disproportionate impacts of those who were dying from COVID because of the racialized labor in this country, yet 2 years on, that sense of hope is for many of us, and I'm probably speaking for myself in particular, is just a sense of loss. Because as you said, there's just been so many events over the last 2 years that have just made that initial sense of hope that at least I had wane significantly. But I'm looking forward to reading Rehearsals for Living and thinking that this could be a further rallying call to reimagining or imagining the world, the abolitionist futures that the two of you are espousing in the book. Before getting to a discussion of the abolitionist futures that you envision in the book, I did want to ask you a question. It stems from the excerpt that Robyn read, and because I'd watched the SFU Library Dean's lecture on information and society that the two of you delivered. And Robyn, thankfully you read the same excerpt, because you spoke about the discussion, your discussion of the climate emergency and the concept of the Anthropocene in that SFU lecture. And I really found it quite fascinating, the way that you framed the concept of the Anthropocene, and how white Western countries' spreading of brutality, slavery, disease, and climate abuse is effectively etching colonialism, imperialism, and racial capitalism into the historical record of environmental change. And yet in your letter, you questioned who is being imagined as human in the determination of the signature of human history. So given the disproportionate impact of climate change on Black and Indigenous communities and the glaring deficiencies in the current global response, I'm wondering from both of you what your thoughts are and how we reform this concept of dating the climate emergency into one that centers the experiences of those most harmed by the violence that has contributed to it. So Robyn, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much for that. And I really just want to highlight that, this questioning about the Anthropocene and thinking about it, in temporalizing it in relation to capitalism, to racial violence, is of course thinking along with the chorus of Black and anti-colonial thinkers. So, for example, Visha Satgar, who thinks of the idea of imperial ecocide and linking these two histories together. Of course, this really great work by Badur Alagra, by Sylvia Winter, who in this interviews with Catherine McKittrick, I think really asks us to think about, again, about wedding these, really wedding this particular historic moment to the history of industrial capitalism. And Françoise Vergès actually, I think, is somebody who's made one of the interventions that I think has stuck with me the most strongly, reframing it as the racial capitalism, right? So actually thinking about the instantiation of racial capitalism as, of course, the time in which the kinds of, if we think with Cedric Robinson about the way that racial capitalism functions through differentiation, right? This hierarchical differentiation, the idea that this was also mapped onto the earth at this time. So this is something that, we were really trying to think through, and I didn't get to read the whole letter today, but thinking about how, for example, in Barbados by the end of the 17th century, if you read Eric Williams's Capitalism and Slavery, you see that the soil was already massively depleted because the ways in which, Black people's lives and bodies were being expended was to extract maximum value, which is why you saw, of course, the life expectancies being, under 30, which is why, again, you saw this mass destruction of the soil because it was to be used as quickly as possible in terms of wealth accumulation. So I think that understanding those histories of environmental brutality against the mass genocide of Indigenous people and enslavement as tied together is really crucial for understanding how to actually think our ways out of this, which of course, if we look to I'll let Leanne give examples as well of this too, but something that I think is really helpful for me to think about is looking at how a lot of anti-colonial struggles, for example, were explicitly always about thinking about relationships to land differently, thinking about these relationships to the environment differently, that we're not starting from square one in a Black radical tradition of trying to imagine what it could mean to create livable futures, of course, outside of carcerality and capitalism, but also outside of environmental devastation, that these movements about refiguring land and the way that we use and relate to the environment are actually questions that Black radicals have been thinking with and organizing around, particularly in the anti-colonial struggle, but of course, given long-standing relationships to land use that predate colonialism, right? So that if we're going to understand a particular historical epoch of the Industrial Revolution in particular, and slavery and settler colonialism before that as these histories of racial violence, then what does it mean to look for other ways in which we have related to the land before, right? And thinking about remembering as a kind of political act as well, of thinking back towards these histories in order to map out more liberatory futures. So I think, of course, I get really inspired by what's happening in the present moment, but I think that it also lets us actually reframe the way we think about the history of our movements. And I think in a way that is helpful because it doesn't make us feel like we suddenly have to address this question from the very beginning, right? So.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful way of thinking about the present moment, not thinking that we have to urgently rethink or think anew about how we move forward, but that we can look back to other examples. Yeah, Leanne, what are your thoughts on how we reframe this climate emergency and center those who are most impacted by it in the discourse?
I was thinking when Robyn was talking back to how when we were writing the book, particularly in those first drafts of the letter, there was a freedom that I felt just to think and to write what I actually thought, and to not pay attention to how white Canada frames these things. Of course, as we started editing and as we got a publisher, we had to spend a lot of time thinking about how the whole thing was going to be reframed from climate change, because let's just call it climate change, and then we don't have to talk about capitalism, and we don't have to talk about world endings for Black communities and Indigenous communities. Let's just talk about this as like a Black mom and an Indigenous mom talking about solidarity and forging ahead with a sisterhood, and then we don't have to talk about icky white supremacy. So I feel like we push back against all of those framings by just being who we are, the kind of dorky, as you can see, academic activists going back and forth. And then now I think as the book goes out in the world, I think that there's a tendency for people who are talking about it to frame it in a way that makes it more palatable to white people in order to sell books. And so I think the pushing back is now going to be to be this phrase. And I think at the core of it, at the core of this book is sort of a refusal of enclosures and borders and private property and prisons and racial capitalism. And we're not willing to have it framed differently than that, because that's our truth. And I think that's what makes this, I think that will create some tensions in some communities, but I think that's also what I'm proud of us for doing.
Oh, that's lovely to hear. So I want to move to a series of questions that I have about abolition, which of course animated the excerpts that you read for us today. And something that has fascinated me about your thinking of abolition and reading every day we must get up and relearn the world is the sort of temporality of abolition as you described it in that piece. So you both discussed the nonlinearity of abolition and how that disruption can create newness, new modes of thinking, new theories, and new questions. And so I want to ask you a question so that sort of brings your thinking of abolition and the way in which it can create newness into your thinking about decolonization in Canada, especially in the context of empowering and liberating marginalized and disenfranchised peoples. Yeah, Leanne, do you want to start off this one?
Yeah, so sure. I have a background in land-based education, and a lot of my previous work has been engaged with Anishinaabe thought, and the way that my people generate new knowledge and share new knowledge is by gathering at sites, often the bush, which is a gathering site, and working together to build something. And that process of working together to build something with our ancestors, with those yet to be born, with all of the different plant and animal and people nations that make up that gathering site is generative in that it generates a shared knowledge. So I've written a lot about that from an Anishinaabe perspective, but that's not the only place that happens. Lots of other communities, particularly in movement work, are coming together in commune, in real time, building the alternative to meet the needs of their families and their communities. And that's a site of generation of knowledge. And so I think for me, I find hope in each of these kind of iterations of this across the world, because we're pushing back against systems that are global. And so we need to have relationships with each other in order to have a full picture of what we're pushing back against. And we often don't come up with answers. We often make a lot of mistakes. The stuff that we're building often doesn't work out. We're not necessarily successful, except at the end of the day, even if we're not successful, we're closer to each other. We're often closer to the land, and we've given something to community. And so that to me is ethical and valuable. So I think I don't know what the world is going to look like, because I only have one part of that knowledge. I need to be in deep relationship with all of these other movements to gather all of that knowledge together to figure out the kind of world that we're going to build. And so it's the practice of this that I'm interested in. And I think for a long time in my work in Indigenous studies, it can be too siloed, just thinking about the impact of colonialism on Indigenous people in North America, in Canada, in my own nation. And I think what I've learned from doing that work is that that's just one piece of it. And there's all of these interlocked and related genocides and movements and anti-colonial peoples that I also need to be in conversation with.
What about you, Robyn?
I loved that question so much. It's one that's really generative, and thanks so much for sharing with Leanne. This is something that I think I just keep revisiting over and over, is the difference between how to think about timelines of racial violence, how to think about what abolition can mean in a way that's, thinking about it as prefigurative, and the ways in which movements are always disrupting linear temporalities and different ways and different schools of thought and traditions. You know, in my own, probably have the most extensive knowledge about how traditions of Black radicalism, for example, allow us for a different way of thinking about time. And then I think really allow us for a different way of thinking about what it means to build more liberatory futures. So something that I had quoted in the article that you're referring to, that Leanne and I had, or the interview with Leanne and I that you're referring to, was this, the words of Sun Ra, that we live on the other side of time. And I think this is something that is so incredibly generative, because if we think about the ways in which a really particular kind of temporality was imposed globally with the project of colonization, with suddenly this idea of this strict notion of past, present, and future, along with this progress narrative that, of course, humanity suddenly was beginning to move like from barbarism towards freedom, which of course, you know, even if you think with what we've been speaking of earlier in our letters, if we reframe, you know, if we think about reframing what's considered the progress narrative as itself violence, as itself the globalizing of racial and ecological violence upon the world, at the same time as the imposition of temporality, actually in that version, then I think it actually helps us to think about the violence of all of those structures being imposed simultaneously, right? So I think that sort of asks and demands us to be on the other side of time, to think about what it means to live in a time in that nonlinear sense. And there are so many really powerful examples of that. I think, you know, Leanne, your work, as we have always done, really crucially helps to reframe this notion, again, of freedom making and the long spanning traditions of that. And Nick Estes, Our History is the Future, right? In terms of just thinking outside of the discrete entities of past as only in the past, right? So, and thinking about traditions. So for example, like Sankofa and Go Back and Fetch What We Forgot, right? This idea, again, of sort of disrupting those timelines, I think is really crucial, especially in the ways in which Black movements toward freedom have always been about creating alternatives, both from the past, but also in the present, and reimagining futures in that way, and actually building futures all of the time, right? So I think if we think about abolition as world building, right, which I think Ruth Wilson Gilmore's work asks us to do, which is something that is really crucial to how I think about abolition, as building and continuously building, drawing on historic different kinds of freedom struggles from the abolition of slavery more broadly, then that idea of this building and then ongoing sense of buildingness is something that I think really allows us to think again differently about the kinds of worlds that we're actually making, that are connected to the kinds of worlds that have been in the making, despite so many timelines being violently interrupted by colonialism, by slavery. So those are, yeah, I hope that's clear. That's sort of some of the way that I find it really helpful to think outside of the way that time has been imposed on our thinking, especially as we come up, you know, it's almost, there's like this end of the world clock that we're getting to in this time of the climate crisis, right? So I think that again is really asking us to just sort of think more expansively about what that has done, what that imposition has actually done as well.
Well, it's a great way to lead me to my next question, because in thinking about the two of your works in preparation for today's panel, and thinking about, you know, how I can draw on your work and those of other, you know, radical feminist thinkers, I was wondering the ways in which the two of you have drawn on the work of radical Black and Indigenous feminists, and how they have informed your ideas of an abolitionist future. And I ask this because, I mean, a lot of the institutions that abolition seeks to dismantle have gendered violence entrenched within them. And so we've seen Black and Indigenous feminists like Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Stormy Ogden, and Assata Shakur all be foundational to the abolitionist movement. And so in your own thinkings of abolitionist futures, how have Black and Indigenous feminisms informed your ideas? Leanne, do you want to start us off?
I think that I've been reading Black feminists for 25 years now, and I feel like they've influenced so much of my work. And I think this book, we name those influences, or we made a point to try to name those influences and bring them into visibility, because I think this body of work that Black feminists have produced over the last 3 or 4 decades is robust and generous and incisive, and it's just been such a beautiful gift. So I think that's been a really big, I think going back to sort of the late 1980s and the early 1990s, when I felt really, really alone as the only kind of Native student in the classroom in universities, there was this body of work that I felt seen within. And so I think that it was a really beautiful kind of pandemic project to not just think with Robyn, but to think with this kind of global community of Black and Indigenous feminist thinkers, and for me to be challenged, rigorously challenged, I think, in my thinking through the engagement of that work. And that's something that I really, really appreciated.
Yeah, that's very beautiful. What about you, Robyn?
Yeah, I mean, like Leanne, thinking about reading Black feminist abolitionists really is like what goes back to my earliest political education. I have this memory of living in Montreal as like a baby radical when I was 18 on the bus to some demo, and I was reading Angela Davis's autobiography. I think that's, for so many of us, that's just sort of those are the intellectual genealogies, whether inside or outside of the academy, that I think helped me to think about the world. But to think about that, in another sense, I do think that thinking about Black feminism and abolition is crucial because in a sense, these are some of the crucial intellectual genealogies of the movement itself, right? So if we think, for example, about, Black women organizing outside the state against lynching, for example, right? Then we have already a kind of trajectory of what it means, of course, of enslaved people liberating themselves from slavery, of course, in which, I think when Angela Davis wrote actually from behind bars about Black women's position in the community of slaves and the role that enslaved Black women played in those kinds of early rebellions, I think that just sort of, again, helps us to rewrite some of that history, to always see Black feminism and abolition as, as tied together, which of course, in the new book, Abolition Feminism, I think really does a good job of tracing those, the always present genealogies, but reading works about prison, about the experience of being incarcerated by Assata Shakur, by Angela Davis, that are highlighting that prisons, even reading those texts, right, written many decades, that prison is of course a site of racial violence that traces back to the idea of slavery and racialized kind of controls, and that it is gender, that the idea of, for example, strip searches and these cavity searches, those very early texts already highlight that the prison is a kind of racialized violence and it's a kind of gendered violence already, right? So those are kinds of interventions that show us that it's never an add-on to say, and also women, right? But to say that how gender functions is actually intrinsic to how all of this comes together. I think also what often gets left out in the ways in which, as abolition is getting mainstreamed, which I still would say is a net good. I disagree with comrades about this all the time, but I think that even though we always have this potential of losing some of the more radical aspects, it's a net good to have it on to have people saying, to have t-shirts at H&M that say abolition is the future, because even if, of course, there is some diluting, I do think that mainstreaming that idea of a world without police and prisons is still a net better. But what gets lost in some of that mainstreaming, which is what I was going to point to, is that some of these histories, of course, if we think about work by critical resistance, if we think about work happening in the 1980s and 1990s, is that it's survivors of sexual violence, survivors of gendered violence, who really are some of the foremothers of thinking about safety and outside of policing, thinking about strategies for what it means to have healthy and safe communities outside of the carceral state. So I think that, again, that's been such an important feminist praxis, really specifically, right? So, this idea, I think it's Dean Spade that, wrote the words, the prison is a serial rapist, right? But the idea, of course, of women having to organize, of course, Black women, Indigenous women, and others, knowing that, for example, we often get this question as abolitionists, well, what about the rapists? But for our communities, the police and prison have also been that, right? So there's always had to be a stream of political mobilizing and organizing and theorizing that always has been saying, what else could we do if not this? Because this has never functioned, right? So that these are not new questions, but there's a really long tradition of thinking about that kind of work. So I mean, this is something that we're, going back and forth so much about in these pages together. And there's so much of really thinking, I think, deeply with even thinkers like Dion Brand as well, who are asking us. There's this one part in the book where we talk about this piece that she'd written that's called 100, I think it's called 100 Musicians at Jane and Finch, where there's this disagreement between lovers. And one of the lovers here, the lover of the protagonist hears that there's going to be 100 policemen going to Jane and Finch. And she says, no, it's 100 pianos, right? That shows us this idea of imagining differently, that couldn't we imagine instead, for this community that's been vilified in the media, like what if it was 100 pianos? What if it was music? What if it was 100 anything else except for police, right? So we have these sort of abolition dreams present in so many of the works of, I think, people who, people who've been so, some of the most historically deprived of freedom are, of course, people who've been able to think about and dream about that more expansively, who've always had to think what else, because the solution has never been the status quo. The solution has not been the carceral state, because that's been one of the primary sites of harm. So yeah, that's a few of the ways. I could probably answer this question for 7 hours, but I won't. But it's something that I think really is like built into the architecture of how we're trying to think through these questions as we're just sort of asking one another throughout the book. So
yeah, thank you, and thank you for that reminder of the sort of the importance of the tradition of Black and Indigenous feminisms, because I think oftentimes in these discussions, and even just in our everyday life, that tradition often gets lost. And so I appreciate both of you for reminding us of the power in those traditions. So just a reminder to the audience, if anyone has questions, please pose them in the Q&A. But seeing that there are none as of now, I will continue with my own line of questions. Oh, Brenna has her hand up. I guess Brenna can't ask a question because she's a panelist, but Brenna, if you have a question, if you want to go ahead and ask it.
Thank you. Yeah, I was trying to use the Q&A function, but it doesn't seem to be working for me. So if it's okay, I'll just ask. Thank you so much for that presentation, and the excerpts that you read were equally, beautiful and devastating at the same time. And I wanted to ask you, particularly with the first part that Robyn read out, was referring, the letter was referring to the kind of globalized condition of the racial capitalocene or climate crisis, or whatever we want to refer to it. And I was wondering if you could comment on the Black feminist traditions, and also some Indigenous feminist traditions, and how, from the 70s and 80s and onwards, how they were very internationalist in scope, and, part of third worldist, anti-colonial movements. And I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about those aspects of these feminist traditions that you, in your own work, are pulling through and working with.
Leanne, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. So I think if we're going back to the 1960s, some of which Lee Miracle was involved in British Columbia as part of the Native Reading Group and NARP, who were working with the Seattle chapter of the Black Panthers, who were learning about Mao, who were taking a very anti-colonialist global perspective, I think, on their work, and doing the legwork of building those real world relationships, distributing each other's newsletters, hosting each other in terms of talks and workshops, and bringing, I think, a lot of anti-colonial writing and thinking into Indigenous communities. And of course, that was also happening in Dene territory. It was, and there's kind of different pockets of it across Canada. And so I think that history to me is important because it's instructive, I think, to the current and the present. And a lot of activism and organizing on social media can be very performative and can get away from those real world relationships, those material gifts of support in terms of crises and solidarity. And it also really brings home Robyn's idea of every day getting up and remaking the world. Every day you've got to get up and re-educate yourself and read broadly and learn what's happening locally, learn what's happening internationally, and be sharing that in the communities that you are present in. And I think of the movement around missing and murdered Indigenous women that so many Indigenous feminists have been working on for 20 years. And in my classrooms, I like to bring that movement in conversation with radical Black feminists writing about abolition, because it becomes very challenging for us to sort of take stock of the ways that we're pushing back against the phenomenon of missing and murdered Indigenous women, Two-Spirit and queer folks, in focusing on police reform, in focusing on legal reform, in focusing on punishment and incarceration. And so that to me is one of those places where if we're doing the work that folks were doing pre-internet, and when you actually had to go physically and sit with somebody and talk and share tea, sit on a front porch, and develop a relationship of trust, which I think is what we were trying to do on the frozen lake at the Chinta. I think that those connections and that sharing can be very profound. So I think I look to those. I don't want to kind of romanticize, because there was lots of problems and there are lots of problems and missteps that are made. But I think that there's something about a deep engagement, theoretically, practically, and being very involved in movements and organizing, not in a way that's superficial and performative, that is very important in this work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that answer. Yeah. What are your thoughts, Robyn?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Leanne. That's really still sitting with that, but now I'll try to answer for myself. So yeah, I think that actually, that idea, this remembering of the ways in which our realities here are linked to these processes of, of racial violence, of capitalism that are always already global. That's something that I think for both of us really permeates the book. And that's something that I think, again, as you point out, Brenna, has permeated at least in, especially I would say in previous generations, traditions of radical thought tradition, like Leanne, in your work, you highlight them, I think really crucially, the ways in which internationalism has been, as you say, it has always been part of these practices and organizing even prior to colonization, right? So I think that something that is really crucial, somebody who I think with, which I think was part of the question, especially both in the book and in my life so much, is Claudia Jones, who in her writing, in the 1940s and the 1940s especially, is linking the lives and fates, for example, of Black women in the Caribbean, descendants of enslaved peoples, colonized peoples, and looking at, of course, how their labor is subsidizing and is creating, the profit and for the global ruling classes in North America and in Europe, is actually linking then the fates of what it means to be a Black feminist in the United States or United Kingdom, where she was, to the realities in which, even as, what she identifies as sort of super exploited people, that there again is this relationship again in the, in the colonies that we also need to take into account to think about who's cheapened labor, particularly for women, right, is creating the kind of wealth that is seen to, of course, somehow just emanate as if it was created by the hardworking virtue of the white working class, right? But where is that coming from, I think is really crucial. So something else that I think we really try to tie into the book is thinking about those freedom dreams that again, extended transnationally, right? So looking back to previous periods of trying to organize what the idea of nation could be outside of the nation state, for example, in the period of anti-colonial nationalism, looking at thinkers of people like Claudia Jones, who were trying to dream up new ways of organizing the world that were against capitalism, that went against the logics of nation state and enclosure really more broadly, right? So that we can actually, again, not only create a new, but trace back these traditions of what else could have happened, which I think in some ways is crucial because it helps to denaturalize things, kinds of violence that we just now take as a given. So like, like the economic violence that is capitalism, like the idea that there needs to be a nation state, for example, like carceral forms of enclosure, right? To remember that these were contested even as they were being imposed, and we're part of a contestation that again dates back and we're inheriting these traditions of internationalism, these traditions of anti-capitalism that vastly predate, of course, our my birth, right? So again, thinking through, Ruth Wilson Gilmore just has a really excellent way of writing about this, and I forget in which piece now, but talking about the ways in which we select our ancestors and the way we select different kinds of historical inheritances. And I think that that's something that, Leanne and I, whether explicitly or implicitly, were trying to think about as we were writing one another. And of course, being in these conversations with some long departed ancestors, with movements today, with things that are happening on the ground, with ideas that have been thrown into ways of thinking about freedom from 100 years ago, right? So thinking about that as kind of a chorus is something that felt really crucial in how Rehearsals was written. And I think how it came out as well, if we did our jobs correctly.
I'm sure you did. And I am definitely looking forward to reading it. So before we wrap up the Q&A, there's one question from the audience. How can university students, as part of the colonial institutions, resist against the university? I tend to have, and this is the audience member asking this, I tend to have conflicting emotions of academia where research and analysis is important, but at times it feels as if I'm reproducing the hierarchies in post-secondary education. Robyn, do you want to start us off? Especially now, like I want to really hear your perspective, since you are currently a PhD student, and what your thoughts of working as a scholar activist within an institution, especially one like the University of Toronto.
Sure. I mean, I think that something that can be helpful is to remember that the idea that students need to be like depoliticized, atomized individuals, again, I'll always talk about how we need to denaturalize certain ideas, but that this is a fraught idea that has been contested and has been lived very differently, right? So if we look, for example, to the example of like SNCC and organizing that was done as part of, in the Black Power era, that a lot of what was happening there was also happening, was also organizing that was happening by students. So I think that we don't have to take up the idea that as a student we need to reproduce the university's order just because it's asking us to, or just because it's positioning to. And I think we can look at different historical moments when students have decided to organize themselves as a group to refuse that, and to try to, again, to push against that separation between sort of the institution and the communities that are ostensibly outside of it. To remember that, especially for Black students, often first generation students, like that idea of that separation is one that the academy might have, but isn't real and lived. So what does it mean to actually take away from that sort of imposed hierarchy and differentiation, and try to, reappropriate those resources, those often, stolen and appropriated knowledge back and forth within and across the community instead. So yeah, there's a lot that I could say about that, but I know we're running out of time. But I guess it's just remembering that the ways that students are positioned, I think, is framed in a way that is very disempowering, and remembering the kind of power that actually is present, and looking back to different times in which students have actually just said, like, no, thank you to that model, I think is something that I find sort of revitalizing, that helps reframe what we think about what it needs to be a university student, for example, or to be a prof as well.
Yeah. Leanne, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I think I'm thankful for that student asking that question and feeling conflicted. That's a really, really good thing. You should feel conflicted and furious and angry and full of all kinds of different emotions. And this shouldn't be your only opportunity for research and reading and analysis. You deserve much better. And so I think that's sort of the reality that that we're living in right now. I think of my ancestors. I think of that generation of Indigenous, Black, Brown women that went just before us and had it much, much worse in the academy. And I think that students have been an incredible force all over the world in terms of organizing and building something different. So that's always my advice to students, is to take the privilege and the resources of the university and redistribute that into community, build the spaces that you want, bring the speakers, organize to bring the speakers in that you want to hear, think of research and analysis and critical thought outside of the silos of the academy. And I think that that work is the kind of work that got me through my degrees. And it's the kind of work that I think can be sustaining, because it's working towards building something different. It's also a tremendous privilege to have, 4 years where all you really have to do is read and think. And so many folks in our communities do not have that privilege. So I also sort of remind myself that as much as interacting with the university can make you feel awful, it's also a privilege that so many folks in our community don't have. And so if you've got 4 years to read, you read everything you can.
Yeah. So, thank you both for that answer. I think in the final 2 minutes, if you don't mind, I feel like it would be remiss of me to not ask you a question about the very powerful concept that you wrote about, Leanne, the constellations of co-resistance, and that I think is something that emerged from the excerpts you read today, and I'm sure permeates the book. And so what I wanted to sort of leave the audience with, and to leave even myself with, is how, for those of us who are, very keen or interested or embedded in this work of abolition, decolonization, and decriminalization, what did the two of you hope Rehearsals for Living, how do you hope that the book will support the movements that you are embedded in, that many of us are embedded in, and how it will further these constellations of co-resistance, especially between Black and Indigenous peoples? Yeah, Robyn, do you want to start us off? 30 seconds or less.
I mean, if I had to give a very brief answer of what that has meant for me as a practice in this work specifically, I think that what we were doing felt like a kind of love work in this way of, and as Leanne had pointed out, this listening work. And I think that we sometimes think about activism as like the really hard parts, when like you're getting tear gassed by the police, and that is a part of organizing and struggle, but also part of it is communing and is convening and is thinking and is, just like that kind of love and listening that I think that we were trying to practice. And again, just to lift up all the other places where that was happening, this idea of care work, and highlighting all the places that we see that care work, that we again see that building that generative side of what it means to struggle. So that would be my very short answer.
Thank you. And what about you, Leanne?
I hope that folks in my community and the communities that I'm a part of sort of read this book and are like, holy crap, I have so much reading to do. I need to go read Robyn's books. I need to go read Andrea Ritchie's books. I need to go read this huge volume of work that has been created by abolitionist feminists. I need to figure out how to develop kind of real world material relationships with anti-colonial peoples in a global sense. And that in Indigenous studies, we can start to see that work of internationalism, of being engaged in a global sense as being something that is as ethical and rigorous and crucial to our world building projects.
Oh, well, thank you both for the answer. Thank you both for sharing excerpts from the book with us. Thank you for the conversation. I'm sure Rehearsals for Living will be a powerful addition to just the body of work that the two of you have already created. And I sincerely cannot wait to read it. So Thank you, Robyn and Leanne, and I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed the presentations today, and I wish everyone a happy rest of your Friday and a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah.